Warning, this chapter contains adult content, so I have recorded that in a separate video for members only. If you wish to read the chapter in its entirety, please visit the link in the descriptions. Indomitable Heart by Renette. Chapter 16. The next weeks were both wondrous and exhausting. Everything about Mira was, in Obi-Wan's opinion, the most amazing thing in creation. But Mira also squalled when tired or gassy or hungry or wet or simply it seemed because they felt like it. Between Jango and Obi-Wan and occasional help from Anakin, Boba, and Ahsoka and even from some of the other Jedi and Mando'a, they managed to settle into a schedule. Obi-Wan took the night feedings at first. Even with Bacta, a surgical delivery took time to heal and Jango was on his back for much of the first few weeks. Miles and Silas were constantly in and out, both just to visit and spend time with them, and to consult Jango on the war, which they were directing while Jango was on leave. Even when they couldn't come in person, Jango spent most of his waking hours on the comm with Gar Command and reviewing datapads. The mental exercise was a blessing. Enforced physical inactivity made Jango irritable, and sometimes his temper and Mira's would feed off one another, Jango's annoyance making Mira cry, Mira's crying worsening Jango's mood. Obi-Wan tried to avert those spirals of discontent by taking Mira on walks through the temple, introducing them to the small world of the Order. Once Jango could get up and walk, he would join them on their adventures, building his stamina back up. As Jango was able to do more physically, Obi-Wan picked up more work for the army, his own stack of datapads growing day by day. Even when they were working those first weeks, Mira would be nestled against one of their chests. Mira napped a great deal, but also didn't sleep through the night, running both parents ragged. They took to dozing whenever Mira did, grabbing a few minutes here, an hour there. Boba took to sleeping in Anakin and Ahsoka's apartment some nights just to get in a restful sleep. Even before his full parental leave was over, Jango could be found roaming the command center as Obi-Wan had imagined him, Mira in a Birikad on his chest. Mira was too young to understand the tensions in the room, although they fussed and grizzled when tempers ran higher than usual. There was no question Mira was Force-sensitive, even at a few months old, and while Jango was growing ever more sure that he wouldn't be surrendering custody anytime soon, he was definitely planning to take advantage of the creche and the basics of Jedi training available there once Mira was a little older. It would be good for Mira, he understood, to be with other Force-sensitive Ik'aad at times, to help Mira learn how to control and utilize their abilities. Obi-Wan followed Jango back to work, much to the relief of the adjutants who worked closest with the Mandalore. Evidently, Obi-Wan learned Jango had worked almost up until his delivery date, although in increasingly short temper. Somehow, Obi-Wan wasn't terribly surprised. Jango wanted the war over as much as anyone. While it could be argued that Jango had gained a great deal by accepting his position as the head of the Gar, Obi-Wan knew his Redur hadn't been looking for that type of power and notoriety. Jango would have been perfectly happy to settle with his clan, taking work as needed and raising their children, defending Mandalore and its people. While they had been on leave, the Shadows had got a mountain of information out of Sadridge Opress. It had taken some doing, and Obi-Wan didn't want to know exactly what methods they'd employed. While Opress hadn't named any names, the Shadows now had some possible locations to search for the Sith working with the Separatists. Teams of Shadows backed by ARC troopers were already speeding toward those locations, knowing that there was a time limit on anything Opress said, and hoping to catch out the mysterious moon that Obi-Wan and Jango had faced on Naboo so many years ago. Obi-Wan was more than content to remain on Coruscant while the hunters sought their prey, even if that often meant spending his days soothing the tempers of self-important senators. He had told the Shadows all he could of the Sith years before, and felt he was of more use as Jango's liaison with the Senate and Chancellery. The war, despite Jango's efforts, was increasingly unpopular, and Chancellor Czar's ratings were tanking along with the number of citizens in favor of the war, despite that the Gar were victorious in the majority of their battles. It was perhaps no great surprise, given they postulated that the Sith was part of the separatist movement, that Jango and the Hutt Mando'a began hearing chatter of an assassination contract on Chancellor Czar in the bounty hunting community. Thankfully, Django's reputation was still strong enough, despite his years of absence, that most bounty hunters of any skill were avoiding the contract. No one wanted to piss Django off by going after the man who was paying Django's contract. Doing so would certainly earn Django's ire, and most of Django's former compatriots in the bounty hunting profession were wise enough to stay on his good side. Django talked quietly to his contacts, his old friends, their friends, and quite a few disreputable characters. Eventually, Django knew someone would accept the contract, especially since the promised compensation kept escalating. It would be in their best interest, Django briefed Chancellor Czar, if they controlled who took the contract. Czar could see the wisdom in that and left the matter in Django's hands. Django called his old friends back and gave them very strict instructions. Accept the contract if it was offered, then ensure the attempt on the Chancellor's life failed. When Chancellor Czar returned to CERN Prime for one of his homeworld's festivals a few months after Mira's birth, he was trailed by Cad Bane, Rhaego Hardeen, and a handful of other bounty hunters. Bane and Hardeen were Django's agents on the inside. Bane and Django had been mutually respected, if not entirely friendly acquaintances in the past, and Hardeen, while not hot Mando'a himself, was a sympathizer from Concord Dawn, Django's homeworld. For additional compensation, the two hunters were willing to double-cross the Separatists and make sure the assassination fell short of its intended outcome. Obi-Wan was a bit hesitant about employing bounty hunters, especially ones with reputations as bloody as Bane and Hardeen. Bane had carved a swath through the Outer Rim in the past few years and seemed to specialize in antagonizing the Jedi. Hardeen's reputation wasn't much cleaner, his skill set heavily weighted toward assassinations. Django pointed out they had to make do with the tools at hand, and Obi-Wan conceded to his pragmatism. Were Bane and Hardeen men that Django would want around his ade? Not by a long shot. But they had at least a hint of professional ethics, and they also understood that new parent or not, Django would hunt them down and pull their lungs out or their noses if they double-crossed him. In the end, Bane and Hardeen were the only survivors of the five-being assassination squad. The Chancellor was unharmed, and Bane and Hardeen were soon paid off and strongly encouraged to make themselves scarce. Obi-Wan was confident they'd surface before too long to cause trouble, but at least there might be a bit of a reprieve in the interim. That was unlikely to be the last attempt at the Chancellor's life, and while most were easily handled by the senatorial centurions and the clones who made up the Coruscant Guard, Anakin wasn't the only Jedi on long-term protection detail. Senator Palpatine went almost nowhere without his hulking Jedi bodyguard Pong Krell, and other Jedi were constantly in and out of the Senate. It was something of a fad, Obi-Wan understood from his conversations with Bail Organa. Senators liked the purported prestige of having a Jedi bodyguard. As a result, Obi-Wan wouldn't have been too surprised if some of the threats reported were more than a little exaggerated. The Jedi did their due diligence when accepting security details, and when threats were found to be less than credible, protection of those senators was turned over to the senatorial centurions or Coruscant Guard. Still, it wouldn't be the Jedi way to ignore such threats entirely, and so the trend continued. Obi-Wan was rather pleased that, due to his role as Gar liaison, he wasn't available for bodyguard duty himself. He already had to interact with politicians far more than he preferred. There were very few Obi-Wan actually respected, never mind liked. Thankfully, there were a few like Bail Organa that he could work with and who he could trust to work in the best interest of the Republic. With the backing of Bail's voting bloc, Obi-Wan was able to not only ensure that the troops continued to be properly outfitted, but that their hard-won salaries and rights weren't chipped away at and pocketed by the more corrupt elements in the government. The delegation of 2,000 also worked to ensure aid made its way through to the war-torn worlds being contested between Republic and Separatist forces. Committee meetings in the Dome were interminable, but at least Obi-Wan often saw Anakin and Ahsoka there, Anakin looming at Padme's shoulder as she advocated for resettlement funds, travel vouchers, food aid, and other causes integral to the mission of the refugee relief movement. Obi-Wan had been impressed with Padme as a queen, and amused by Anakin's unrelieved adoration of her. But her politics were what ensured Obi-Wan's respect for Padme, although she did tend to be rather idealistic. She had served her people well as queen for years before taking up the cause of the many refugees throughout the Republic and advocating strongly for galaxy-wide abolition of slavery. Given the Naboo had tried to cast down the term limits Padme herself had enacted to grant her a third term as monarch, Obi-Wan was a little surprised she hadn't been vaulted onto the galactic stage as senator. It seemed that Palpatine retained a good enough reputation on his homeworld to prevent his ouster. Instead, Padme worked with Bail with some frequency, his legislative record testament to his support of unilateral abolition of slavery, as well as his commitment to benevolent aid and continued efforts to bring the war to a close. The longer the fighting continued, the more the Senate polarized between those like Bail, who advocated exploring diplomatic avenues, and the more warlike faction who advocated for atrocities of every nature. Given how unpopular the war already was, Obi-Wan was certain that ramping up military production and building more powerful weapons would only further distance the separatists from the Republic and incite further disapproval from Republic citizens. Despite that, Bail's attempts to find a diplomatic path couldn't seem to gain traction. Month after month, the war dragged on. While he was glad he wasn't in the fighting himself and knew he was helping Jango a great deal, Obi-Wan did occasionally feel as if he could be doing more. At the same time, Obi-Wan didn't want to shift positions so that he was being sent out of the temple frequently, not while Mira was still so young. Despite his preferences, eventually the council had a mission that Obi-Wan simply couldn't refuse. When mutterings of young Force sensitives going missing began surfacing, the Jedi were duty-bound to investigate. At first, it was younglings not yet dedicated to the temple, taken from their parents and guardians. But then initiates on learning excursions began to go missing too. Some might argue the Order didn't have the jurisdiction to search out children not yet in their care, but they could certainly send out knights after their own lost younglings. Obi-Wan was tasked with discovering if the kidnappings were linked to known separatist agents, or if someone was merely taking advantage of the Jedi being spread so thin to acquire vulnerable Force sensitives. Most of the missing younglings were recovered by Jedi searchers assigned to the task. Anakin's own Padawan was kidnapped, nearly driving Anakin mad with worry, but thankfully Ahsoka rescued herself before long, with the assistance of a Wookiee named Chewbacca and a group of Jedi initiates already captive on Weska. From Ahsoka's report when she got back to the temple, it seemed her abduction had been chance. The Trandoshans who kidnapped her and the other initiates solely interested in the challenge of hunting Force-sensitive sentients rather than due to their political stance on the war. Searching for information on how their initiates had been targeted led to evidence of even darker deeds. Hints of the Sith they had hunted for so long. Obi-Wan knew he was likely taking his life in his hands when he accepted the mission to once more hunt the Sith. He accepted nonetheless. He wanted his child to grow up in a galaxy free from fear, and he would readily give his own life for that purpose. Jango wasn't exactly thrilled, but he understood the sentiment. Obi-Wan deployed with a group of ARC troopers trained by Jango's Alpha class. They were younger than the Alpha ARCs, and in some ways it showed. Despite their youth, they were more than competent and good company to boot. The four of them, Obi-Wan soon learned, had been trained together. Pons was the eldest, and he, Bly, Wolf, and Cody were batchmates as well as squadmates. They had been engineered and trained to be officers and went back and forth between commanding large sections of the army and running high-risk missions like the ones they undertook with Obi-Wan. Their progress was slow, but eventually a tip from Cat Bane himself, in a rare moment of conscience, led them to an abandoned castle on an unlisted lava planet where a nursery held a half-dozen miserable Force-sensitive younglings. The troopers destroyed the droid attendants and downloaded what information they could, Obi-Wan shaking off his paternal horror to blanket the younglings in his welcoming presence. It was clear the Sith had been there recently and had a nefarious agenda utilizing the innocent beings. But it would take time to decrypt and analyze the data recovered, time they might not have. Obi-Wan contented himself with the knowledge that the younglings would be safe soon. After a detour to Coruscant to drop off their young charges at the Jedi Temple's Kaysh, Obi-Wan and his squad headed back out chasing shadows while Gar intelligence and Jedi slicers went through the data from the Sith's outpost. Following the data, Obi-Wan and the clones, Vode they called themselves, found numerous other bases, all abandoned. In most, there wasn't even data left behind, only dust and droids. Eventually, an informant passed word of Higo Damask, who the Jedi were now fairly certain was the Sith Lord Obi-Wan had met on Naboo, operating on the fortified banking clan world of Mygeeto in the Outer Rim. Republic forces had tried repeatedly to take Mygeeto since the beginning of the war, understanding that if they could occupy one of the banking clan's mine worlds, they might be able to starve the separatists of funds for war machines. With the sighting of Damask, Republic forces began building up their presence, and for the first time since giving birth, Jango left Coruscant. Capturing Damask was just too important to leave to his seconds, no matter how much Jango trusted them. Mira was placed temporarily in the Kaysh, and the Mandalore and his personal guard of Alpha Arcs were soon present in the Albaro sector. Obi-Wan was happy to see his Redor after months of separation, and even put up with the teasing of his clan, who he'd become more than a little fond of as they hunted together. Breaking through the ranks of warships protecting Mygeeto took time, even with the myriad wings of Mando pilots throwing themselves at the blockade in their Comrade and Fang starfighters. Obi-Wan knew as the space battle began that they would likely find a situation similar to the other Sith outposts. An abandoned base, defunct equipment, perhaps some fragmented information on whatever experiments Damask was carrying out. The ultimate goal, of course, would be to capture and eliminate Damask, but Obi-Wan was aware that was unlikely. Nonetheless, if they could find solid evidence of his nature, or perhaps a link to his collaborator in the Republic, it would be a terrific boon. The blockade was still partially in effect when Obi-Wan and his squad reached the surface of Mygeeto, having slipped through the sensor nets without detection. While Damask Holding had technically been rolled into the larger intergalactic banking clan some years previous, Obi-Wan intended to search any property he could find that was linked to either the company or to the Damask family. In the records, only Higo II still lived, but Obi-Wan was well aware how easily records could be forged or changed by someone with as much power as Higo Damask. The first few properties they searched were bare, save deactivated droids and dust. Obi-Wan was beginning to think their informant had been mistaken, until they found a subsidiary held by a shell company held by a trust. On the surface, it appeared to be a lab for testing and authenticating industrial-quality crystals. With so much of the Mygeeto economy depending on mining and its byproducts, Obi-Wan wouldn't have been surprised if the facility had truly once served that purpose. The building reeked of the dark side and something else that set Obi-Wan on edge, raising his hopes that they might find something of strategic value within. Sensitive to the moods of their Jedi, the ARC troopers grew even more alert as they traversed the seemingly abandoned labs. While the upper levels were conspicuously empty, Obi-Wan felt there was more to the property. It took a little hunting, but soon enough they found a hidden back entrance leading into a retrofitted mine. The lights were still on, and if it were possible, they all would have grown more wary yet. They found rooms abandoned in a hurry, droids hastily deactivated. The deeper they went down, the more clear it became that they had stumbled on something the Sith wished to remain unseen. And then they found the first body. The being was near mummified, and from the myriad wounds on the corpse, had clearly been tortured, but Obi-Wan still recognized him. Master Sifo-Dyas, his own master's contemporary and friend, whose disappearance Master Dooku had investigated for years. Obi-Wan wondered if Master Sifo-Dyas had died alone here under the Sith's machinations and shuddered. "If we can, this body should be brought back with us to Coruscant," Obi-Wan said quietly over their in-helmet comms. "He was a Jedi." The troopers nodded slightly, their shoulders bunching slightly in weary tension. "Should I be collecting data?" Wolf asked as they passed back out into the corridors. "Normally I'd say yes, but I don't want us to split up," Obi-Wan said grimly. "No one separates from the group. No one gets left behind." "Lek," the troopers chorused back almost in unison. Obi-Wan nodded and they moved on. Their findings only got more grim from there. Bodies of animals and beings who had clearly been experimented on, vivisected, and left to die in agony. Obi-Wan shuddered in revulsion. The Force was quivering with distress and anticipation. Deeper and deeper they went. dreading each new horror they would find. One room contained cages of animals unlike anything Obi-Wan had ever seen before, the Force shuddering with wrongness around them. One of the voted paused and took off his helmet to vomit when they found the twisted body of one of their brothers, who had clearly been experimented on, cybernetics blinking against cadaverously pale flesh. "We'll come back for him," Obi-Wan promised, rather wanting to vomit himself. It wasn't truly a promise he could make, but if they were going to carry Sifo-Dyas's mortal frame out of here and ensure he had the proper funerary rites, the trooper deserved the same honors. "Me, partayli, darasuum," one of the troopers rasped out over the body. They moved on. They had to keep moving. Finally, they could go no deeper unless the last laboratory hid another way down. Carefully, they opened that last door, not sure what they would find within, not sure they wanted to learn. The lab was dim at first, the lights guttering. As they stepped in, the lights began to brighten, working off some type of sensor. There was a body laid out on an examination table, not unlike scenes they had found above. But here, there was the barest flicker of life in the Force. Obi-Wan darted forward, then stopped short, staring in horror as he recognized the still form. Yan! Barely recognizable, but Yan! Alive. Barely, but alive. "Master!" Obi-Wan gasped out and rushed the rest of the way to the temple, shrugging off Cody's cautioning hand. Dooku was emaciated. His withered frame bore clear marks of torture. Lightning trees bloomed red and purple beneath crepe-thin skin gone faintly yellow with jaundice. One of his arms was amputated at mid-biceps, the stump badly scarred and misshapen. From the scarring on his torso and legs, he'd clearly been nearly eaten alive by something with very sharp teeth and claws. Nexu, Obi-Wan's memory supplied, remembering Mace Windu's strained tones as he related the barest details of Yan's supposed execution. Even worse than the physical damage, Yan's Force presence would all be gone. "And..." Yan barely managed to rasp out, clouded eyes skittering from shadow to shadow. Obi-Wan gently grasped hold of skeletal fingers, pressing Yan's remaining hand to the metal of his chest plate. "Elek! Buir!" Obi-Wan choked out in Mando'a. "Cuyi!" "And..." Yan breathed, a thin, bloody smile blossoming across his gaunt face. His breath rattled in his chest, cracked lips oozing blood into his scraggly beard and mustache. As much as Obi-Wan would have liked to deny it, it was clear Yan didn't have much strength left. "We'll get you out of here, Buir," Obi-Wan promised. Already the others had begun carefully going through the room, slicing what data they could from the servers and pocketing chips and pads. "Sith," Yan read out. "We know," Obi-Wan promised. They hadn't been expecting to find Yan at all. Just another abandoned laboratory full of half-destroyed experiments left to molder when the Sith moved on. Yan was supposed to be dead, years dead, killed at the outset of the war that now engulfed the Republic. "The one?" Obi-Wan asked, just to be sure they meant the same being. "The mask," Yan identified, "likes to experiment." Obi-Wan grimaced. That much had become clear. For all the Jedi prized knowledge, Obi-Wan wasn't sure he wanted to know just what Damask was trying to discover or determine, especially now that he knew that Yan had been the subject of some of that experimentation. Obi-Wan dreaded finding out just what had been done to his master. Even as Obi-Wan loosened the last restraint from Yan's skeletal form, a wave of livid, dark energy roiled down over them. Obi-Wan turned, half expecting what he would see. A tall, robed form stood in the doorway, heavy mechanical breathing filling the air. It could be no one but the Sith, Obi-Wan felt. He faced his nemesis, his lightsabers hissing as he activated them. "I should have known it would be you, Kenobi," Damask rasped through his transpirator. He stepped forward, revealing himself to be a tall Mun with elongated features, the lower half of his face hidden behind his breathing device. It connected about his upper torso, and from the bulk, Obi-Wan was sure it would be armored. "Majesty Damask," Obi-Wan greeted, dipping his head but not taking his eyes off the Sith for a moment. "Plagueis," Yan hissed behind Obi-Wan, revealing the Sith's chosen name. Obi-Wan flicked his eye inside his bouche, activating his recording system and hopefully relaying a live feed to the mythosaur in orbit above. Damas let out a thin, unamused laugh, then raised a long-fingered hand and threw lightning at them. The troopers wisely scattered. Obi-Wan caught the wave of electricity on his blades and advanced. It seemed the Sith no longer bothered with the lightsaber even for show, fighting only with the Force. It would hinder Obi-Wan. He was unpracticed against those who fought solely with that inevitable energy. As if to prove the point, Plagueis broke off the lightning attack and used an emphatic force shove to throw Obi-Wan across the room. His Beskar clanged resoundingly off the wall as he was unable to break free from the wave of energy before impact. For a moment he choked, an inexorable pressure tightening around his throat. The troopers unleashed a wave of blaster fire, Cody and Wolf powering on their jetpacks despite the contained space to gain an elevated angle of attack. Plagueis let Obi-Wan go, lashing out with another wave of the Force, this time sending the troopers bowling over one another and into the walls. Obi-Wan bounded forward, enhancing his speed with the Force, skidding between the troopers and Plagueis. The Mun hissed in surprise as Obi-Wan attacked with energetic ataru. He'd been cross-training all the lightsaber forms while stationed in the temple, and while Saresi was his style of choice, he was more than proficient in all, save Vapad. Obi-Wan had to fight with everything he was to hold his own against Plagueis, even with help from the troopers. He used both his lightsabers and every scrap of the Force he could grasp hold of to keep the Sith at bay. When he couldn't block Plagueis' attacks fully, thankfully Obi-Wan's Beskar was sturdy enough to prevent some of the damage the Sith tried to inflict. Still, Obi-Wan knew that it would be in his best interests to ensure the fight ended as soon as possible. If the duel lasted very long, he and the troopers would likely die and leave Yan to the Sith's evil designs. It was that thought of protecting his beloved Buir that gave Obi-Wan the strength to continue. The Force was riotous in his head, dark and light clashing on the metaphysical plane, even as Obi-Wan threw his body forward in the mortal realm. The beleaguered light, so long beaten down in this place, swelled in concert with Obi-Wan's determination. Obi-Wan's bright blue blade seared through the shadows and Plagueis went down, transpirator hitching and hissing as Obi-Wan's lightsaber severed crucial connections. Swiftly, Obi-Wan detached the Force-suppressing restraints from his utility belt and secured the Mun's thin wrists. No! Plagueis hissed, struggling. Obi-Wan did his best to still the long, flailing limbs, but despite his age and apparent frailty, the Sith was not weak. Plagueis jerked sharply, then let out a rasping, choked laugh and twitched weakly, suffocating as the transpirator failed and his airway collapsed. Kriv! Obi-Wan swore vehemently. He started chest compressions, well aware of the irony of trying to save the Sith Lord he'd just been dueling. But if Plagueis could be interrogated, they would be closer to finding the Sith in the Senate. With the heavy machinery of the armored breathing apparatus in the way, there was little Obi-Wan could do. Plagueis passed into the Force, laughing, knowing he had thwarted the Jedi and furthered the plans for Sith dominion, at least for a little longer. Sure, I've got the Marines on long-range sensors. Seems the Mandalore punched through and sent us some backup. Pons responded. All right. Obi-Wan sighed tiredly, standing and staring at the tangled limbs of the Sith. Scrub this place of any data you can find. Are the Marines sending a medvac or just reinforcements? A first would be much more useful. Wolf snorted but kept his opinion to himself. They all already knew it anyway. It was no secret he didn't think Marines were terribly useful. Medvac is with him, Pons affirmed after a moment. Obi-Wan nodded, then crossed back to Yan, tugging off his boucher and bowing down to brush his forehead against his old master's. Sidious, Yan rasped out. His breath rattled deep in his chest, and Obi-Wan's heart ached. Had he found his master again just to lose him once more? What about him? Obi-Wan asked gently, catching up Yan's hand in his, holding those thin, bony fingers to his chestplate. Palpatine, Yan said, voice low and thin. Of Naboo. Obi-Wan's heart chilled even as he nodded. Sidious is Palpatine of Naboo? Obi-Wan asked, just to be sure. Yan nodded weakly, and Obi-Wan could feel the old man's strength failing. Rest, master. I'll watch over you, Obi-Wan promised, his own voice thick with emotion. Yan nodded again and settled. Obi-Wan kept hold of his hands, his entire focus on the almost imperceptible rise and fall of Yan's too thin chest. Obi-Wan carried Yan up out of the labs himself, walking in a daze with his troopers around him. The Marines took custody of the bodies, including Plagueis and Cyare. It wasn't until a medic tried to take Jan from him that Obi-Wan fully zoned back in. He nearly snarled at the medic before realizing he was in an active landing zone. Blinking rapidly, Obi-Wan surrendered Jan to the medics, then stepped back to get his mind into the game. Mygeeto was still an active theater of war, and while his priority mission of finding the Sith Lord had been accomplished, there was still much to be done. Turning, Obi-Wan soon found the voting command of the Marines charged with the ground assault, a steady commander named Bakara. Cody and Bly were with him. Evidently, he was another of their benchmates and had been trained up with them under the Alpha Arcs. It didn't take long for Bakara to send Obi-Wan back up to the Mythosaur and Jango. Obi-Wan didn't even fight the order. He wanted his Rador. He wanted his boar. Obi-Wan let Pons lead him to one of the drop ships, and he rode up with the injured who were headed to the infirmary. Someone, likely Pons, had calmed ahead to Jango, and the Mandalore was there in the landing bay to meet them to sweep Obi-Wan into his arms. Obi-Wan leaned into Jango's firm hold, resting heavily against his Rador for a few moments.
Mygeeto.
Jango's voice came soft and thick over their private comm channel.
Kaysh morut'yc.
Obi-Wan let himself fall apart at that, leaning his full weight into Jango, head resting on that broad shoulder.
Morut'gar.
When Obi-Wan could breathe again through the iron band around his heart, he let Jango lead him through the massive battleship to the infirmary. The medics were prepping Yang for a full immersion in Bacta when Obi-Wan and Jango arrived, and a Jedi healer was with them. Obi-Wan was certain he'd never been so relieved to see the familiar blue robes of the healers in his life. Jan caught his eye and smiled weakly, even as a breathing mask was strapped to his face. Obi-Wan's old master looked even worse in the bright light of the infirmary, but Obi-Wan's heart thrilled to see him. Jan reached up, trying to tug off the mask so he could speak. The healer, a Panthoran with curling gold marks on his forehead and cheeks, pulled Jan's hand away, gently chiding the aged master. Jan glared weakly and satisfied himself with signing at Obi-Wan in abbreviated Mando hand talk. Obi-Wan smiled tiredly at his sharp, jittery gestures, his master assuring him that Jan would be okay, that they would talk soon. He signed back his agreement, his love, his joy at seeing Jan again, alive.
Cuy'gar, drashaar, dralshy'a, akaanir, nakar'tuur.
Obi-Wan encouraged, nearly choking up. Jan nodded sharply, and then the healer was putting him under with a sleep suggestion so he could be moved into the tank.
Come on.
Jango urged gently after a little longer, and Obi-Wan let himself be led back to their quarters. Jango gently stripped them both of their armor, then tucked Obi-Wan into their bunk before preparing some shig. Obi-Wan dazedly accepted the steaming mug, blinking rapidly when the steam fogged in his face, and he burnt his tongue on the hot drink.
False, Jango!
Obi-Wan breathed, and Jango rapidly grabbed the shig back before it tumbled from Obi-Wan's fingers.
He's been in the Sith's hands this whole time, and we never knew, never imagined he was anything but dead. When you were gone, we could convince ourselves, reassure each other that we would find you, that you were still alive out there with Jan. We never even thought to look. We knew he was dead.
Jango said nothing, just joining Obi-Wan on the bunk and wrapping his arms tightly around Obi-Wan. The idea of any of their family, and they both had very large families, in the hands of the enemy was devastating. They also had no way to keep it from happening again.
The cuyi.
Jango reassured, and Obi-Wan turned into him, burying his face in Jango's shoulder and weeping quietly. Jango held him until the tears passed, then gently thumbed the wetness from his cheeks.
Cold flannel,
Jango suggested, and Obi-Wan nodded. Jango rose, padding to the fresher to wet a face cloth. When he returned, Obi-Wan was sipping at his tepid shig.
Buir,
Obi-Wan said quietly, and Jango gently tipped up his chin to wipe his tear-splashed face.
Naas.
Jango returned to setting aside the cloth and then sitting at Obi-Wan's side.
We have a pretty good block of time in hyperspace. You should probably rest.
Obi-Wan tensed a little, always disliking being told what to do. He relaxed a moment later, knowing that Jango only mentioned it out of concern, and he was tired, despite that the shig was a mild stimulant. He hummed equivocally, and Jango snorted, then took away the mug and rose. Obi-Wan grumbled under his breath, but curled into the blankets. When Jango came back from the fresher, Obi-Wan was resting, if not yet sleeping. Jango smiled fondly, then stepped out into the corridor so he didn't disturb Obi-Wan when he calmed one of the other officers and let them know to direct all business to his personal frequency. Settling into the small desk in their quarters, Jango picked up one of the datapads and worked quietly while Obi-Wan settled into sleep. Occasionally, Obi-Wan would shift in his sleep, and Jango would look over, seeing if he needed to wake his dralshy'a from a nightmare, or if he was just restless. He worked his way through a few reports before Obi-Wan stirred with more intent.
Jango?
Obi-Wan called, voice thick with sleep.
Hola,
Jango called back softly.
Cola,
Obi-Wan said, holding out his hand. Jango shook his head, but went, taking off his boots and settling into the bed at Obi-Wan's side with a pad in his hand. Obi-Wan turned into Jango's warmth and settled back down. Jango finished the datapad he was working on and set it aside, glancing over at his full desk, then at his sleeping dralshy'a. With a sigh, he burrowed down into the bed, curling around Obi-Wan and letting his eyes close. Obi-Wan woke hours later, half pinned under Jango's bulk. He debated getting up, then just burrowed closer. His motion, though small, was enough to wake Jango, who nuzzled into his cheek. Obi-Wan shifted, pressing their mouths together in the kiss he knew Jango was seeking. They kissed slow and easy, trading breaths between them.
Mygeeto darasuum,
Obi-Wan muttered, needing to affirm their love verbally, needing it heard.
Mygeeto,
Jango returned, and Obi-Wan huffed, leaning in to kiss him again. The kisses Jango returned were chaste at first, but as they shared warmth and comfort, need began to bleed through. It wasn't so much simple lust as a desire for reassurance. Jango's need to see with his own eyes that Obi-Wan had once more returned to him whole and safe.
Elek,
Obi-Wan breathed and rolled onto his back, pulling Jango over on top of it. Jango grunted softly, but knelt up, pulling off his undershirt. Beneath him in the bunk, Obi-Wan wriggled out of his own underclothes. They both shuddered when Jango laid back down, reveling in the slide of bare skin as they kissed again. Hands mapped familiar bodies, and then Jango was kissing his way down Obi-Wan's lean form, kissing and teasing all the familiar places that set Obi-Wan's pulse racing. When Obi-Wan woke hours later, Jango was already at the desk again, a small holoprojector letting him direct the grounded space forces by comm without leaving Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan smiled and rose. Jango glanced over and quirked his mouth slightly in a faint smile of greeting.
I've already let the council know you pulled Yan out of that pit. They want to work with you,
Jango said. Obi-Wan grimaced. He should have contacted the council as soon as Yan was safely in the bacta tank.
I'll call them as soon as I'm functional,
Obi-Wan said and padded to the fresher to wash up. He quickly got cleaned up and dressed, and he and Jango exited their quarters together, headed for the bridge. Jango was soon deep in conference with his officers, leaving Obi-Wan to his business. The first call Obi-Wan placed was to the infirmary to get an update on Yan's health and to warn the healer that he was about to calm the council, and they would likely want a word with the healer too. Maze answered the hail to the temple, and Obi-Wan gave the master of the order a grim smile in greeting. Shortly, the other counselors were all present via holo, their little blue figures flickering across the distance. Obi-Wan gave a detailed report on the base and what he and the troopers had found there. He had told them about the experiments and the bodies and finding Yan. He told them about fighting Darth Plagueis and how the Mun refused to be taken alive. The identification of Palpatine of Naboo as Darth Sidious he kept secret while speaking over the military frequencies. That was news to be shared in person, or if not in person, in the most secure manner possible. While the GAR comms were well encrypted, a senator sitting on committees dealing with military appropriations like Palpatine did could easily access GAR communiques. The council debated briefly, then directed Obi-Wan to remain aboard the Mythosaur with Yan. The massive warship had one of the most extensive medical suites in the fleet, and it would be better for Yan to be treated there than to transport him to Coruscant on a different ship. So Yan remained unconscious in bacta, Obi-Wan visiting him daily and meditating in front of the tank, reaching out in the Force to see if he could help his master heal while the Mythosaur finished overseeing the taking of Mygeeto. Aware that Yan's information needed to be passed to the council through some manner other than GAR comms, Obi-Wan spelled out his master's accusation against Palpatine in text. He wrote in Mando'a, then layered every encryption the Jedi had come up with over the files before sending them over his personal frequency to his friend Bant, with a plain text instruction to deliver the encrypted file to her former master. Kit Fisto was fairly newly raised to the High Council, and passing the data through Bant was the safest compromise Obi-Wan could think of on short notice. He knew that the counselors would probably think that amount of security overkill until they translated the document, but the information needed to be shared, needed to be known by more than just him. While the Mythosaur was a well-armed and armored vessel, it wasn't unreasonable to fear death while in an active war zone. As Obi-Wan and the Jedi had thought, Ego Damask II, now revealed as the Sith Lord Plagueis, had been the one propping up much of the separatist fight, both on Mygeeto and elsewhere. With Plagueis removed, the intergalactic banking clan on Mygeeto folded like a Corellian with a bad backhand. The Marines were pressing forward and easily taking their objectives, with more than sufficient assistance from the various flight squadrons of Vode and Mando'a flying support under the direction of Jango's trusted Hot Mando'a. They'd soon have complete control of Mygeeto and its wealth of resources. Finally, a week after Obi-Wan and his team had slipped through the blockade and begun their searching, the remnants of the banking clan on Mygeeto surrendered. A detachment of troopers would remain on planet to keep the peace, but the Mythosaur and some of the other ships could withdraw. Now, the Mythosaur's primary objective was getting Yan, Obi-Wan, Obi-Wan's squad, and their information back to the Jedi Council. The Order needed to know just what Senator Palpatine was so they could bring him down. Even when he was eliminated, though, Obi-Wan knew there would be no easy fix for the state of the galaxy. Many of the Separatists had legitimate concerns about the Republic and their place in it. Corruption had been running rampant for years before war broke out, no doubt helped along by Plagueis, Sidious, and their forebears in the Sith line. With Plagueis defeated, Obi-Wan had hopes that some of the animosity might abate, allowing for a diplomatic solution.